Welcome to the All Things Event Planning with April podcast. If this is your first time listening, then thanks for coming. Each week, we'll be spilling all the secrets that other event planners and industry professionals don't want you to know. From negotiating for the perfect venue to knowing when to walk away from a project, we'll give you the expertise so that you can plan any event, regardless of your experience level. Now, let's get into this week's topic with your host, April.
Hey there, and thank you so much for joining us this week on the All Things Event Planning podcast with myself here, April. And if you missed last week's podcast, I'm just going to do a quick overview right now. So last week, we discussed 3 ways of getting into the event planning industry and you don't have any event planning experience. So if you're interested in learning some quick ways of breaking into this fabulous industry, you should check out our last episode, which was our very first episode of this podcast, and then come right back over here and listen to this episode. Won't he do it? Yes, God. So today we are going to be discussing how far in advance you should be planning an event. Now, anyone can really use this advice. I think it's very helpful if you know how to structure this for upcoming important aspects of your life, or if you're working with a client and they're not quite sure of how to plan out such a large event or a small event, then you should use these tips as a good rule of thumb. So the first thing that I like to do is look at the person's budget, right? And here is the theory on the budget. So for example, if you have $100, you're not going to need a year and a half to spend $100. You can blow $100 at Red Lobster's. You know what I'm saying? So if you have a small quantity of money, then you know it's going to happen pretty quick. I mean, I don't hear of weddings unless you're a celebrity being like $30 million and it happens the same day. That ain't what's happening here, okay? That ain't what's happening here, okay? So if you have a very small budget, then you know that it's going to happen relatively quick, right? Small budget is relative. And what I mean by that is it really depends on the person, the couple, the client, what they considered small. So that's why I'm not throwing out a particular budget, because everyone's pockets is set up a little different. You know what I'm saying? So after you determine the pockets, you also then need to determine what type of event it is. Something like a wedding, a conference, you're going to need a lot of time to plan that, right? Even award shows take a year to plan. So, or as a rule of thumb, right, if you're thinking about a large, important event, award shows, galas, weddings, you're going to need at least 6 months minimum to make sure that it is done correctly. And 6 months is just the tip of the iceberg. Something like a wedding can take up to 18 months to plan and execute. Same thing with certain award shows, conferences. So keep all that in mind, okay, when you're thinking about how far in advance you should be planning this event. And also you should advise the client or person that you're working with too. Like, if they have $10,000, it's a good amount of money. When the average cost of weddings is upward of $27,000, you definitely know that $10,000 is on the smaller end. So you know it's not going to be expensive, and a lot of things that you need to execute can be done relatively quickly. Now, if someone's spending $100,000, okay, then you know it's going to take a little longer to execute that. And money does determine the amount of time that it needs to take, because the more money that's involved, the more people hands are in the pockets, right? So if you only have one decision maker, usually a parent, then it's a little easier to navigate. But if you have like a whole network of people, there's no way you're going to be able to execute an event under 6 months. So those are some of the things that you can do to determine how far in advance you should be planning an event. Also, keep in mind if you're having a US based wedding and you're having a wedding outside of the state that you're from or the state that you live in, that also should be calculated into the time of how long it's going to take you to plan this event out. Because remember, because people coming from all over the country, around the world, that takes time and you have to incorporate that into your planning. So just keep that in mind when you're working with clients or working with people on how far in advance you should be advising clients or even yourself when to plan an event. And I think that the more time you have, it ends up being more cost effective too, right? Because if you're planning something last minute, then you're paying last minute fees, upcharge fees. So having more time to plan it out will just save you and everyone involved in the long run more money and have a happier experience. So that is the end of this week's episode. Please make sure that you come back next week for another all things event planning topic that we're going to discuss. As mentioned in the start of the show, if you missed last week's episode, make sure you click on that and make sure to subscribe and visit us on our website where all of the show notes will be available, which is platinumeventsbyapril.com. And I look forward to speaking to you next week. Take care.
You've been listening to the All Things Event Planning Podcast.
All Things Event Planning Podcast.
With your host, April. Loved this week's episode? Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or Google Play. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.